These are the reasons why people gain so much fat when they come off of keto. It is a very real thing. It's not just water weight. People think, I come off of keto, I'm going to just retain water because of the carbohydrates. Sure, that's part of the situation, but no. People legitimately do rebound. And it's not because the carbohydrates and it's not because of this whole rebound effect that we think it is. It's a very logical situation. And it's very easy and practical to fix if we understand what's going on. At the very core of what is happening, you are adding carbohydrates back into a diet, but typically not reducing fats enough. That is the simple piece. Now we're going to break this down more because there's a lot of other pieces too. Essentially, you now have a very high caloric diet. You went from eating very low carbohydrate with moderate protein and a high amount of fat. And now you've added carbohydrates into the mix. And even though you've probably reduced fat a little bit, you probably haven't reduced it enough. So now you've got hyperpalatable fats and hyperpalatable carbohydrates, leading you to this very high calorie diet. But there's another situation that also comes into play. Now that you have carbohydrates in the equation, carbohydrates, or at least insulin in this case, will inhibit lipolysis. The presence of insulin will stop fat loss from occurring. So that makes you think carbohydrates are the problem. That's right, I put the carbs back in and they stopped the fat burning. No, we always have insulin happening whenever we eat, right? So we're going to have a certain degree of inhibition of lipolysis, of stopping fat burning. The problem that we face here is now we have high amounts of fat, but we also have high amounts of carbohydrates that are spiking insulin and making it impossible or difficult to burn the fats that we are also consuming. In addition to this, we also have what's called metabolic gridlock, where you have so much in the way of fats and carbs probably coming in a sort of overfeeding fashion that our mitochondria become a little bit disgruntled, right? That's a lot of fuel coming in at once, and that's hard on the body. You've continued to eat the very fatty cuts of meat that you would normally eat on a low-carb keto diet, but you're doing that alongside carbohydrates. You see the problem here, right? But then it continues on, because in theory, when you come off of keto, in theory, you could actually look leaner. The reason behind that is because your glycogen stores would fill up, your muscles would volumize a little bit more, and you might actually look leaner. Now again, in theory, it's less caloric density, right? You've gone from fats, which are 9 calories per gram, to carbs, which are 4 calories per gram. So your stomach has probably shrunk, being adjusted to more caloric density. So in theory, you should be able to eat more volume of food and actually consume less calories. But if you're not reducing the fats when you come off of keto, that's not happening. We have to simply remember, as much as we don't like to hear it, that in healthy people, fats store easier than carbs. I know it's not what we want to hear. And don't get me wrong, as a low-carb person myself, I am not the biggest fan of copious amounts of carbohydrates, but I'm leveling with you here. This is real stuff. From a very simple biochemical perspective, fats literally store easier. De novo lipogenesis, storing fat from carbohydrates, is a multi-step, 7 or 8-step process, whereas storing fats as fat in excess is quite easy. So when you add fats plus carbohydrates and you're eating too much, it's a recipe for gaining weight very fast. Now, in this video, as we get towards the end, I'm going to share things that you can do if you are someone that's coming off of a low-carb diet and you're transitioning, things that you could apply that'll make a lot of sense. But there's still more to this equation. The next problem is people add in the carbohydrates because, yes, they're being added in. But instead of just adding in the carbohydrates in addition to protein, they tend to eat their carbohydrates and by default reduce their protein intake. So now you have an increase in carbohydrates, probably a very little decrease in the fat intake, and a pretty significant decrease in protein. So now you're left with less lean body mass being preserved, so you can decline in your resting metabolic rate, but you also are less satiated because protein is very satiating. So now you've got carbs, which are essentially going to probably make you feel more hungry because it's something new, right? And when we look at this, it's a simple food volume thing again. If you started adding carbs in, something has to give. Okay, fats are so small in their actual volume, but high in their caloric density, that's not a big leverage point for your overall volume of food. So really you have a competition between carbs and proteins. You added carbs back in. Are you making sure your protein is where it needs to be too? So you should be reducing that fat, increasing that protein, and also subtly bringing carbs back into the equation. That's how you find balance. So what you need to do initially with that is if you have to use a protein shake, do it. You need to get the protein in, otherwise you're going to fall victim to the appetite stimulating effect of carbohydrates in which you are not used to at this time. So a protein shake, maybe some beef sticks, something like that. I popped the link down below for ones that I recommend. A company called Apex. They have really good beef sticks, but they also have what's called biltong, which is air-dried biltong. So it's like what they have in South Africa. So they take beef and they air dry it. So instead of jerky, where it's aggressively dried and it gets really hard and stiff, this is very soft and tender. So it's almost like having portable steak. It's really, really cool. They've got some good flavors too. They've got like peri-peri flavor, which is one of my personal favorites. They've got teriyaki, which is still a gluten-free teriyaki. They've got original. The stuff is super good. I popped the link down below. Again, even whether you do keto or not, it's worth having some healthy beef meat snacks around, and they're leaner cuts, so there's not a lot of fat. So it's very, very low calorie, pretty much just straight up lean protein. Pop that link down below. And again, it might sound contrived, but the bottom line is like you can use a shake, you can do whatever. You don't have to get biltong. I'm just suggesting it because it tastes good. They've been a sponsor on this channel for a long time. I know the owner and it actually is legitimately helpful. So that link down below saves you some cash and you can check out all the different flavors, their beef sticks, and also their biltong down below. Hyper palatable. Fats are hyper palatable. So when you are doing keto, the fats are still something that the brain registers a reward with. It sees that and it lights up a particular region of the brain. Have you ever noticed that? Like a high fat food, even if it's not sweet, makes you feel something. It feels good, right? You crave fat sometimes and then you get them and brain lights up. Carbohydrates do that too, except they do it in a different area of the brain. So what we've seen under functional MRI scans is that fats light up one area of the brain, make you excited. Carbs light up another area of the brain and make you excited. So when you take fats and carbs and combine them, you now have a hyperpalatable response that you have not experienced in a long time. You've been doing keto, so you've been getting one side, the fats, the hyperpalatable side from the fats, that initiation. But you haven't felt both in tandem because you haven't been eating carbs and fats. Now, whether you are going hog wild or not, you're adding both of them into the mix, and that is going to light the brain up much more like a Christmas tree. You got fireworks now. It's gonna make you hungry. That's harder to control. So with this, it becomes very, very important that you exercise some restraint and you have stopgaps in place. I'm telling you, it's real. People come off keto and they get fat, and it's a problem. And then they blame keto because they say, well, keto only worked because it was this, and then now, it wasn't an actual fix. It is a fix, it can work, but you have to also be responsible when you come off. Here's a few things you can do. First off, time your carbohydrates around your workout first. When you first implement carbs, you want to time them around your workout, and that's the only time you have them to start. I might get some crap for saying this, but carbs generally need to be earned. And that's not like creating an eating disorder type pattern way of thinking. It's simple. Carbohydrates are fuel for movement, right? Carbohydrates are fuel, and the brain needs those carbohydrates for energy, right? We should initially earn them. Carbohydrates either pre or carbohydrates post-workout. That's a great way to indoctrinate carbs back, and then you work outwards as a radius from there. Next up, you want to make sure you're increasing your fiber content. People add carbs back in, and there's something called carb curiosity. I kind of made it up, but it's real. You've been devoid of carbs for so long that now you're curious about all these different carbs you haven't had for a while. And once you get the taste of that blood, you get those carbohydrates, you're like, I gotta go for more. And it's easy. You wanna reach for all kinds of different things. So having the fiber sort of blunts that blood sugar response, but also keeps you satiated. Of course, the protein piece is a very important piece too, but I don't need to beat that into the ground. We know that's important. So beef snacks, protein shakes, high protein with meals, whatever. Protein in the morning, protein before bed, whatever you gotta do, okay? Next up is start small. You don't need to have an on-off switch from keto to high carb. That's just not how it works. You should probably be responsible with the amount of carbohydrates you bring in and start small anyway. Number 5 is a very basic one, like we've talked about before, and that is reducing the fats. Realistically, for every 1 gram of carbohydrate that you increase, you probably want to be decreasing the fats by a half a gram. Okay, so if you add 100 grams of carbs in, you should theoretically decrease 50 grams of fat to keep your calories equal. I'm not saying that thermodynamics is the only thing that matters, but it's a general rule of thumb to follow. Leaner cuts of meat is going to be an easy way to get around this too. If you're normally having ribeyes and you switch to a filet, you just reduce like 30 grams of fat in a single serving right then and there. You don't have to go low fat, but you do need to be cognizant of it. The next thing is, and the last thing, is you need to change how you train a little bit. If you are now adding carbs into the mix, you should try to burn them, which means you should do more anaerobic type work. Your resistance training might need to be a little bit more difficult. You might need to do more HIIT. You might need to do more higher intensity work to utilize those carbs. This is also going to help condition the mitochondria to upregulate glucose transport systems so you're good at using those carbs. That's why there is such a pivotal difference between someone that is sedentary that consumes a lot of carbs and someone that is active that consumes a lot of carbs. Okay, 2 completely different sides of the coin. So with great carbs come great responsibility. You need to burn them the proper way. As always, I'll see you tomorrow.